So I'm following Jesus, or I'm considering doing so, and how do I know that the Christian faith is real and true? Well, we're going to discuss that in this video. This video is a part of a larger series of videos called The Disciple. If you go to our YouTube channel, Bethel Pittsburgh, you'll find a playlist titled The Disciple. And in that playlist, you'll see that the titles of the videos themselves will say The Disciple and then say a category, and you'll notice that all the videos are clustered together in category order. This particular video is under church history, and you'll notice that there's a number of videos already above this one that discuss in greater detail some of the aspects that I'm just going to summarize in this video. But I want to make sure that we're maintaining a flow of thought. So what's going on is that God created the material universe, and He created you and I, all of humanity, and there's certain realities to that design and ways to relate to God and who we are, past, present, future, all of that stuff sits in that context. And it's what makes people struggle with where the Christian faith came from, because the terms Christian faith and even the revealed central figure of Jesus Christ in name and in physical appearance doesn't happen until the first century, plus a lot of the practices and ideas within the Christian faith don't surface until the first century. So it makes people feel like the Christian faith began in the first century, but actually the Christian faith is believing in that same only one true God that created all of the universe. And so the Christian faith actually began from the very beginning. And what happens is, over time, during the biblical time period specifically, God is doing very supernatural events, historically documented supernatural events. Sometimes He's speaking directly to groups of people. Other times He's speaking indirectly. Most of the time He's speaking indirectly through human beings who are then validated. Their words and teaching and declarations of prophecies are validated by the supernatural working of God in those events, whether it's supernatural miraculous things or it's supernatural predictive prophecy. But there are supernatural events that are occurring throughout this biblical time period from the beginning leading into the first century. And so that gives validation to the Bible. You also, in the Old Testament, and it bleeds into the New Testament, in the Old Testament you have a very ethnic-focused, nationalistic-focused, politically focused vacuum that sits in, that creates a context that once you bleed into the New Testament, now you're expanding that faith outside of that ethnicity, outside of that national scope, outside of the political scope, and you're heading into a lot of conflicts and confusion that happens as that transition takes place. It's why Jesus, in many ways, why He was rejected and why there was such opposition to the Christian faith, not only from the Roman society, but from the Jews as well. So you have all of that playing itself out. Then you get to the writings in the New Testament, and all of those things are taking place. And plus, keep in mind that during this time period, there's still a lot of history that's happening outside of that context, and a lot of developments taking place. And the further you get removed from the people who had direct interaction with God and direct connection with some of the creation idea, the flood stories, and because they're closer in proximity to it, you move further and further away from it, and now the memory of it's fading, and the accuracy of it, and some question marks as to how to relate to each other and God and who we are and all that stuff, and asking those questions without direct access to some of that stuff. And you get the development of other religions and other worldviews and things of that nature that are surrounding the biblical context. And then you get to the New Testament, where they're now taking the Christian faith, the Jewish into Christian faith around the world, particularly in the Roman Empire, and they're running into these other arenas. And so what happens is then you begin to get Paul's missionary journeys primarily. You get some other missionary journeys in there. I think we've mentioned Thomas in here as well, possibly his missionary work to India. But you get this working taking place, and you have, again, part of what was in the midst of that is this development of centrality around a library of books called the Bible, and that's the foundation for faith. You get a number of practices like a righteous living, a sacrificial lifestyle towards God and humanity. You get leadership and organizational structure and a gathering of people, kind of context for the purpose of support and accountability. And you get all these things that surface, and now you're moving on into these other cultures. And again, reasons why there's a lot of issues that begin to surface from all sides, from the Jews against the Christian faith and from the Roman government and other cultures against the Christian faith. And so it leads into persecution that begins to take place, and it's the reason for it because it's a culture war, basically. You're in a time period where there's more brutal behavior, even though we still have some of that today, but there was a lot more acceptance of brutal behavior amongst society during that time. And so you get the persecution that starts taking place. The first large wave persecution that was coming more from the Roman government was under the Emperor Nero, and when that starts to erupt, it leads into the execution of the Apostle Peter, the execution of Paul. Many of the apostles are dying out, and many of the church leaders are dying out during that time around the 60s of the first century. And so you're cutting the legs out from underneath the church, and things are kind of spinning into chaos at that point. It's also the same time that Rome begins to have conflict with the Jews specifically, Christian or non, against the Jews, and it leads into this climax of 70 AD where you have this invasion and the destruction of the temple as a consequence of it. And so a lot of fallout takes place from that, and so just everything's kind of crazy at this point, and it's the reason why what the biblical age is coming to a close. The only thing that's still outstanding is the Apostle John, which we're going to get to in a second here. The Apostle John is still outstanding, so he's still present during this time. So you have at least a key biblical figure there. You have some biblical writings that are still to come. Likely his writings came after this point. It's possible that he wrote down some of it prior to, but his writings like the Gospel of John, his 3 epistles, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and then you got the book of Revelation that are still kind of outstanding. So you're still kind of in the biblical age, but we're in kind of this transitional age where there's a decrease of the supernatural activity. There's a drop-off of biblical writing with the exception of John. And so you're losing that biblical authority. It's now only tied to the text of Scripture. And so now we're entering into a space where everything that's happening doesn't have God directly speaking into it, aside from referring back to Scripture. And so this is a point in which people struggle with what is the right version of the Christian faith, what is the right way to approach this, because there were still conflicts that happen. And it's not that we can't say that there's wrong concepts that emerge, because you have false teachings emerging in the first century church. You even have it in the Old Testament in the form of false prophets. And so there was always this counter to the true version of the faith that is there. But you had biblical texts that were arguing directly against those specific things. And now we're entering into a space where there's Bible to indirectly speak to these things, but it's not directly countering these things. And so now you're going to have to decide, what is actually biblical and not as we move forward through church history. So it creates this open door that happens. You also have a lack of ancient history, because the Bible's being protected, it's being copied, transcribed, and protected, and lots of manuscripts produced. And so we have a lot of detail about a lot of the events and the words and the teachings that are happening during the biblical age, and we start to get much less of it once we enter into this transitional stage and start moving into the 2nd century, which is actually the hundreds, 100 to 199 AD. You get a second wave of persecution that surfaces, and that's kind of the focus of this video, is this second wave of persecution that comes from the Roman Emperor Domitian. So he reigns over Rome from 81 to 96 AD, and he starts persecuting them about 8 years into his reign, so about 89 to 96, so about a 7-year period, which is an interesting thing because a lot of what happens during Domitian's time could be a fulfillment of some of the Revelation-type ideas, a 7-year tribulation period. So that's possible there. So this stuff will affect how we view what happens here, will affect how we interpret certain biblical events and prophecies and things of that nature. Certainly the church age at the time was coming to the conclusion that this was fulfillment of some of these prophecies. But we know that Jesus did not return yet, and so that's part of what creates some question marks as to what's happening here. But again, about a 7-year period of persecution. They were still using crucifixion as one of the means of executing people. I'm not sure if we're entering the stage of the arenas where they're having these gladiator fights between Christians fighting against defending themselves against wild animals before a large crowd. I think that's when we're getting into the 2nd century, but that's certainly on the horizon at this point. John gets pulled within this persecution, John the Apostle. They actually attempted to execute him through boiling him in oil, and he somehow managed to survive, and the result was they decided to exile him to the island of Patmos, and the island of Patmos is just off the coast of modern-day Turkey, what then would have been Galatia. And so he's exiled to this island, and that's actually sits between, in the waters between modern-day Turkey and Greece. It's closer in proximity to modern-day Turkey. And so he's in that context. That's likely where he wrote the last portions of Scripture. And people were required to take oath test of loyalty to the emperor. They had to perform a sacrificial ritual, a sacrifice to the emperor. Often it was in the form of a statue of him, as he is a deity. And of course, the Christians could not comply to that, and the result was many of them were executed. And so this is this widespread persecution that's happening. And what is the fallout of that? So most Christians do not question the Christian faith to this point in history. Where the question marks are coming from are from skeptics or non-Christians, or some will question whether or not the Domitian persecution actually took place historically, and so there's debates about that. No debate about the Nero one, so there's at least one, but some debate about this. But again, it's mostly questioning Christian history than it is whether or not it's historically accurate, because part of the reason is what this does. These two waves of persecution with Nero and then with Domitian demonstrate the validity of the Christian faith, because again, at this point, the Christian faith is still in its infant stage. It did not have any political power, hence all the persecution. And so how in the world did the Christian faith survive these two waves, and more to come, waves of persecution, and then end up with political power? How did that happen apart from a miracle of God? Because certainly there were all kinds of motives as to why people should turn away from the Christian faith given these persecutions, and yet people didn't. And so what was happening there that allowed it to survive? There was efforts to eliminate the manuscripts of the Bible, and yet the Bible survived intact, and that's really how in the world did that book stay intact going through all of this stuff. It's also the reason why we, like I had said before, we get much less detail as to the history that's taking place, because the Christians are running for their lives at this point. They've lost their leadership for the most part. The supernatural events are really not taking place anymore. They're being heavily persecuted, and they're just scattered. They're meeting in houses, but maybe not for long periods of time because maybe they get discovered, and so they're just on the move, and it's not really top priority to record history at this point. And so you do get some recordings of it, but you don't get a lot, and it kind of fits more in the category because you're not protecting manuscripts anymore. And so it fits more in the category of the rest of ancient history, which the rest of ancient history is more similar to this transitional phase into the 2nd century of church history, where you're more spotty and scattered in your resources you could point to as to the things that were taking place during this time. So that's where we sit in church history. And so we're transitioning, we're getting ready. There's still maybe a couple other things to touch on, but we're getting ready to transition into the events of the 2nd century and the implications of that into our modern world. So if you have any questions on that, just leave that in the comments below. I'd be glad to answer those. Or if you would like to grow in your faith in person, we'd love for you to join us. We are in the Pittsburgh area. If you're living in the Pittsburgh area, at 2501 Staten Street. We meet Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. and Sundays at 10 a.m. Or if you want to join us live streaming, we do stream our Sunday morning 10 a.m. services live on our YouTube channel, Bethel Pittsburgh. We'd love for you to join us. May God bless you.